unicorn, and in fact, it uses it in 9 different places. So what people do is they look at that and they say, well, look, this is crazy. This is Greek mythology. This is fiction. This is just sort of wacky stuff. And the reason they say that is when people think of a unicorn, what do they think of? They think of a horse that has a big pointy horn. And they say, well, there's nothing like that, right? Those things don't really exist. Let me read to you a couple things from the dictionary. So the first source that I'll use is the Oxford English Dictionary, which is really the authoritative dictionary of the English language. So I'll first read definition, Roman numeral 1a. A fabulous and legendary animal, usually regarded as having the body of a horse, with a single horn projecting from its forehead, the monoceros of the ancients. And so the first definition of unicorn in the Oxford English Dictionary is a fabulous creature exactly like this. It's a horse with a single horn. Let me read to you the next definition in the Oxford English Dictionary. Used in Middle English versions of the Old Testament to render the Vulgate unicornus or rhinoceros. If you skip down to definition number 7 in the Oxford English Dictionary, it reads simply this: the one-horned rhinoceros. So in other words, what is one of the definitions of the term unicorn? Rhinoceros. If you look at Webster's 1828 dictionary, Webster's 1828, first definition, an animal with one horn, the monoceros. What does mono mean? One, and ceros meaning horn. This name, I'm quoting the dictionary here, is often applied to the rhinoceros. Now, here, what am I saying? What I'm telling you is the explanation is very simple. People see the word unicorn, they have an idea in their mind of what a unicorn is, and so they say, well, the Bible obviously is wrong because there's no such thing as unicorns. What it would always be good to do before you reach the conclusion that a credible authority is wrong is you should ponder and say, well, let me think about this. Let me make sure I understand what's going on. Because if you actually just take the time to read the dictionary, it tells you that the word unicorn can mean what? Rhinoceros, right? And you can see the one horn there. There are different species of rhinoceros. There's some that have 2 horns. There's some that have 1 horn. But it's fairly clear that what's going on, and in fact, if you recall in Numbers 23:22, God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. Would it be reasonable to describe this creature as having a lot of strength? Obviously it would. So, simple answer there. Whenever you come across the word unicorn in the Bible, it's referring to the monoceros, or what we would call the rhinoceros. It's not a mistake. It's not that the writers, the translators of the King James Bible were idiots and they thought, oh, well, it's a reference to Pegasus. No, it's none of that. They're using the word in a proper way, and what happens is our own ignorance may cause us to believe the Bible is in error. Get Job chapter 40. So, easy answer for what the unicorn is. The unicorn is obviously a rhinoceros. The next thing we're going to look at is the behemoth. The word behemoth only occurs in one place in the King James. That is in Job chapter 40, verse 15. Job chapter 40 and verse 15. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee, he eateth grass as an ox. And so there's this behemoth creature that's described. We're going to look and try to understand what that is. If you look at study Bibles, many will say that the behemoth is a hippopotamus or an elephant. Now just take this for what it's worth. You would actually be better off if you took all your study Bibles and all your commentaries and you just lost them and you started believing the words on the page. You'd be just far ahead. What people often say about the behemoth is that it is a hippopotamus or an elephant. Well, let's look at the verses and see what we can find. So verse 15, Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee, he eateth grass as an ox. So obviously it's a herbivore. It eats plants. Verse 16, Lo now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. Verse 17, He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together. Now, we've only gone 3 verses in looking at the behemoth, but can you already tell whether or not the behemoth is an elephant or a hippopotamus? What did verse 17 just tell you? His tail is like a cedar. What's an elephant's tail like? Small and thin, right? What's a hippopotamus's tail like? Small and thin? It's not something you would describe as a cedar by any stretch of the imagination. So the behemoth, whatever it is not a hippopotamus and not an elephant. What's always amazing to me is that you'll read commentaries on the Bible and they will reach conclusions that are directly opposite of what the Bible itself says. Whatever this behemoth is, it's not an elephant and it's not a hippopotamus. Well, let's keep reading. Verse 18. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. So obviously an incredibly strong creature. Verse 19. He is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword to approach unto him. Surely the mountains bring him forth food, where all the beasts of the field play. So pretty clear that this is a land-dwelling creature, isn't it? Because of the beasts of the field, and he eateth grass like an ox. Verse 21. He lieth under the shady trees, in the covert of the reed and fens. That's the idea of a swamp or marshy land. Now, in verse 21, just notice this. He lieth under the shady trees. Sometimes there's the idea that the behemoth refers to a whale. What does verse 21 tell you about that? I mean, it can't possibly refer to a whale because it's lying under shady trees. Verse 22, the shady trees cover him with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass him about. Now notice verse 23. Behold, he drinketh up a river. Isn't that fascinating? As big as elephants are, would you ever think of an elephant drinking up a river? It's not reasonable. Behold, he drinketh up a river and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. So this creature obviously has to be enormous, right? It has to be just an absolutely massive creature, something far, far larger than an elephant. Verse 24, he taketh it with his eyes. His nose pierceth through snares. Now, what's interesting about verse 24, when it talks about his nose pierceth through snares, that's telling you it's a very difficult creature to hunt. A snare is a trap. And so this creature is such that it's obviously very difficult to hunt him. And then, of course, go back to verse 19. He is the chief of the ways of God. So this creature is somehow the chief of the ways of God. It is extraordinarily large, very difficult to hunt. And so what I'm going to just suggest to you is this. Consider whether this animal is a dinosaur. And so let me show you one thing here. Whoops. You know, it's funny. That was the last thing I wanted to do. Super disappointed about that. So think about the chart. The flood is right there. The flood is approximately 2300 BC. So the earth is roughly 6,000 years old. If you use the Usher dating system, creation is approximately 4004 BC. The flood is roughly 2300 BC. Now, as you're thinking about the flood, let me ask you this question. Did the flood cause the extinction of any animals? And the answer to that has to be no. Because what did God command Noah to do? To get 2 or 7 of every kind and bring them on the ark. So the flood itself did not cause the extinction of any animals. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So what that means is whatever animals existed prior to the flood continued to exist after the flood. Get with me Genesis 46, verse 13. Genesis 46, verse 13. And the sons of Issachar, this is giving a list of the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. Genesis 46:13. And the sons of Issachar, Tola, and Phuvah, and notice, Job. So in Genesis 46, we see Job mentioned, and Job, of course, is the subject of the book of Job. Job is the oldest book in the Bible. Genesis was written by Moses subsequent to that. Based upon the best dating we can tell, Job is written approximately 1700 to 1600 BC. So just follow what's going on. Creation is roughly 4000 BC. The flood is 2300 BC. Job lives 1600 to 1700 BC. He's actually over here. So 600 to 700 years after the flood. So if that's the case, and Job is writing about the behemoth as a dinosaur, that means the dinosaurs didn't die out immediately after the flood. They lived for some time. Get with me Genesis 9. Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. Genesis 9, verse 28. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So if you recall, before the flood, who's the longest living man? Methuselah. He lives 969 years. Noah's life, he's obviously 600 years at the time of the flood, and then he lives 350 years after the flood, so he lives to be 950. So at least as to Noah, it doesn't seem his life expectancy was cut particularly short as a result of the flood, because he lived almost to be as old as Methuselah. But get Genesis 11, verse 32. What we're going to see is that the generations subsequent to the flood decrease in their longevity. Genesis 11, verse 32. And the days of Terah were 205 years. It's a long time compared to today, but not very much compared to people before the flood. Get Genesis 35. So we're going through the book of Genesis. Now we get to Genesis 35. Genesis 35, verse 28. And the days of Isaac were 180 years. How long is that? 180, right? A score is 20. 4 times 20 is 80, so 180. So notice Noah lived 350 years after the flood. Then we saw Terah, his life expectancy was 205. Isaac, 180. Long compared to today, but do you see the trend? What's happening? The farther you go this direction, the life expectancy is declining. Get Genesis 47. Genesis chapter 47. Genesis 47 and verse 28. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. So now we're down to 147 at that point with Jacob. Get Exodus 6. Exodus 6, verse 16. And these are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations, Gershon and Kohath and Merari, and the years of the life of Levi were 137 years. Verse 18. And the sons of Kohath, Amram and Izhar and Hebron and Uzziel, and the years of the life of Kohath were 133 years. Verse 20. Skip to the last part. And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. So you can see at the time of Exodus, people are living relatively consistently around 130 or so years. So you can decide for yourself what that means. What I think that's indicating is this. Prior to the flood, was there rain? No. There's the mist that comes up from the earth that waters the ground. Subsequent to the flood, of course, there's rain, there's the rainbow, and what seems to happen is the earth's climate fundamentally changes. And so as a result of that, as you go from after the flood to 600, 700, 800 years out, man's life expectancy declines. When you hear scientists talk about dinosaurs, they have all sorts of theories as to why dinosaurs went extinct. You know, meteors and things like that. Well, one of the things that may have simply happened is the flood changes the climate of the earth. As a result of the changes to the climate of the earth, man's longevity decreases, and the ability of some creatures to live may well decrease as well. So let's go back here to what this illustration just shows you, the largest land animals to ever live were sauropods. They happen to be plant eaters, by the way. Remember how we read about the behemoth? What did he do? He ate grass like an ox. And to give you an idea how big these creatures are, that right there is man. That's an elephant. Remember how the behemoth drinketh up a river? Well, can an elephant drink up a river? Obviously he can't. But look at some of these creatures. So these things are massive. And by the way, could you call that a tail like a cedar? It seems that you could. So it seems to me what's going on is that when the behemoth is described, what it seems to fit, that we have an awareness of, is it seems to fit a description of some of the largest dinosaurs that were known to exist, or at least believed to exist. Get with me Genesis chapter 10, if you would. Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens after the flood. And there's a man named Nimrod. Look with me at Genesis 10, verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. Well, how was he a mighty one? What did he do? Verse 9. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now there's all sorts of theories as to how Nimrod's a mighty hunter. Did he hunt men, or did he hunt and bring people food, and so because he brought people food that he became significant? I don't know that Scripture really reveals it, but it seems to me the following is the case. If you're a mighty hunter, you probably have to do something more than catch squirrels, right? And if you're a mighty hunter at that time, what do you have to hunt? Well, presumably you have to hunt the biggest things that exist, right? So my guess as to why Nimrod's a mighty hunter is that he hunted the largest, strongest creatures that existed. Now, by the way, would it be possible for those things to go extinct? Do you think things like that can hide under a bush and avoid detection? Or if there's a concerted effort to hunt these things, how long are they going to last against man with cunning and tools and weapons? So that's my understanding. That's my best belief as to what the behemoth is. It's obviously a land-dwelling creature. It has to be grass-eating, has to be a herbivore, has to have a tail like a cedar. His strength is in his navel, right? All of it seems to fit. So that's my sense of what the behemoth is, based upon what the Scriptures tell us. So get Job 41. This leaves us next with the Leviathan. We talked about how the behemoth, some people think, is a hippopotamus or elephant, and it really can't be that. The Leviathan is mentioned in multiple places in the Scripture. It's mentioned in a very detailed fashion in Job 41. And what people say about Leviathan is that it's a crocodile or a whale or a dinosaur. But let's take a careful look at it and see what we can learn. The first thing I want to do is I want to give you some comparisons between the behemoth and the Leviathan. So I guess just read verse 1. Job 41 verse 1. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Now, get with me. So this is the chapter about Leviathan, but get Job 40 verse 20. So you're going to flip back and forth a little bit here. In Job 40 verse 20, surely the mountains bring him forth food, where all the beasts of the field play. Now that tells you the behemoth is a beast of the field. He's a beast that dwells on land. Look with me at Job 41, verse 31. He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. He maketh the sea like a pot of ointment. Well, the behemoth was a land-dwelling creature, but what is Leviathan? Obviously, it's a sea-dwelling creature. Keep Job 41, but get Psalm 104. Psalm 104. Psalm chapter 104, Verse 25, Psalm 104:25. So is this great and wide sea, wherein are things creeping innumerable, both small and great beasts. There go the ships. There is that Leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein. So very clear, isn't it, that the Leviathan is a sea creature, the behemoth is a land creature. Get Job chapter 40, verse 23. Behold, this is the behemoth. He drinketh up a river, and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. So the behemoth drinks from a river, but the Leviathan obviously lives in the sea. So they're clearly different creatures. Now notice this also. Job 40 verse 23 says, Behold, he drinketh up a river. Look at Job 41 verse 21. The Leviathan, his breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. Verse 19. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. So the behemoth drinks water, but what comes out of the Leviathan's mouth? Flames, fire, different sort of creature. Get Job 40 verse 18. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. So the behemoth's bones are described as so strong that they're called their strong pieces of brass. They're like bars of iron. But notice what we're told about the Leviathan. Job 41 verse 27. Job 41:27. He esteemeth iron as straw, and brass as rotten wood. So the behemoth was a very strong creature, but is the behemoth anything compared to Leviathan? Not at all. The behemoth's bones are described like iron and brass, but the Leviathan views iron and brass as what? Straw. So the Leviathan creature, as impressive as the behemoth was, the Leviathan is something totally beyond in terms of strength. So get Job 41, verse 33. Now I want to read you a verse here, and I want you to tell me what it tells you. Job 41, verse 33. Speaking of the Leviathan, it says, Upon earth there is not his like who is made without fear. So there's nothing quite like him. And he's made without fear. Well, if the Leviathan is made without fear, what does that tell you about him? Well, let me ask you this. Is the Leviathan part of animal creation? Get Genesis 9. Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. Genesis 9:1. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth. Notice verse 2. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, and upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. What God does in Genesis 9 is God puts into all of animal creation the fear of man. Verse 2 is very clear about that. But when we read Job 41, and it describes Leviathan, what did it tell us? Upon earth there is not his like, who is made without fear. So what can the Leviathan not be? Well, it can't be an animal, right? Now, by the way, when we were in Job 40, and it said of the behemoth that he eateth grass like an ox, when you read Job 41, you should take the time to do this, you're never told about anything that the Leviathan eats. I think there's a reason for that. So go back to Job 41. Job chapter 41, verse 15. Job 41:15. His scales are his pride, shut up together as with a close seal. So this creature has scales, and they're his pride. He's obviously very proud of them. Look at verse 34. Notice what's said of the Leviathan. He beholdeth all high things. That's weird. He lives in the sea. How does he behold high things? Then notice what it says. He is a king over all the children of pride. Now, based upon that verse, who does Leviathan sound like? Satan, doesn't he? Look with me, if you would, at 1 Timothy 3, verse 6. 1 Timothy 3, verse 6. First Timothy chapter 3, verse 6. 1 Timothy 3 gives you the qualifications of a bishop. Verse 6 is one of them. 1 Timothy 3, 6. Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Incredibly revealing verse in 1 Timothy 3. What was the devil's problem? Pride. So when we read about in Job 41 that this person is, the Leviathan is a king over all the children of pride, it seems to connect very clearly with Satan. Another thing to notice, because people sometimes wonder about this, 1 Timothy 3:6 specifically says that the bishop should not be a novice, shouldn't be a beginner or a, early on in their journey. You can decide if this is true or not, but a question that people sometimes wonder is, how long after the creation of Satan did he rebel? Was it millions of years? Was it a long period of time? I don't think it was. I think he rebelled soon after he was created. I think he was a novice. He was a newborn, fairly young. And what happened is he was lifted up with pride, and that, of course, was his undoing. Get with me, Isaiah chapter 21. I want to show you several verses here that will establish, I think, beyond doubt, that the Leviathan is Satan. Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1. In that day, the Lord, with his sore and great and strong sword, shall punish Leviathan. So notice what's said here. The piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. So Leviathan is compared there to the piercing serpent, the crooked serpent, and a dragon. Well, let's keep reading. Get Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12. Revelation 12. Revelation 12, verse 9. Revelation 12 describes the war that occurs in heaven in the middle of Daniel's 70th week. Obviously, that's in the future. Notice Revelation 12, verse 9. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, notice, called the devil and Satan. So we see in Revelation 12:9, as clear as can be, that Satan is also called the devil. He's also called the piercing serpent, or he's called that old serpent, I'm sorry, and he's called the great dragon. Well, doesn't that language sound exactly like what we just read in Isaiah 27? Look with me at Revelation 20, verse 2. Revelation 20, verse 2. And he laid hold on the dragon, notice, that old serpent, which is the devil. So I think it's very clear when you look at the cross references, the Leviathan is obviously a reference to the devil. That's why in Job 41, there's nothing said about what the devil eats. He doesn't have to eat, right? That's a requirement of physical creatures like animals and man, but it's not a requirement of him. So, go back with me to Job 41, if you would. Job 41. Job 41, verse 1. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Now we know the Leviathan is a sea creature. We've seen that multiple times. What's fascinating about verse 1 is it talks about drawing him out with a hook. And then it describes a cord that is let down. What activity does that sound like? It's fishing, right? This Leviathan is a sea creature that's somehow in the depths that has to be drawn out. Now, by the way, notice something about Job 41. You see how there's all those questions? What God's doing is He's asking man, can you do these things? And of course, the answer is man can't, but God can. Then look at verse 2. Canst thou put an hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn? Look with me at verse 7. Canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears? See, what's being described here about this Leviathan is the process of how you would capture a large fish. You've seen this before, but just to state the obvious, if you're fishing at sea, you typically will use a hook and a cord that you let down, and you'll catch the fish in their jaw or in their face somehow. You'll reel them in. Once you get them close to the boat, what's the next thing you do? You want to hit them with a spear, right? Because the fishing line is very thin, and you want to then hit them with a spear. So what's being described in Job 41 is exactly how you would land, how you would capture a sea creature. Now put this all together, I want to ask you a question. Here's what we know about Leviathan. He lives in the sea. He's an enormous creature. He's incredibly strong. He has scales. He's described as a king, and he breathes fire. All of those things. So what does that remind? Is there any fictitious creature in modern literature or entertainment that reminds you of? Anyone have an idea? Who's that? That's Godzilla, right? He's really happy in that picture, right? You know, he's sort of dancing. But if you think about Godzilla, is he a sea creature? Yes. Does he have scales? Yes, he does. What else does he do? He has really bad breath, right? He breathes something that's very much like fire. You can see the scales well in that, can't you? And then you know what he's actually called? King of the Monsters. Where do you think that part of his name comes from? First three letters. This is from Wikipedia, so you know it's true. Within the context of the Japanese film, Godzilla's exact origins vary, but it is generally depicted as an enormous, just like our Leviathan, violent, what does this say? Prehistoric. Was he called the old serpent? Huh. And he's, of course, a sea monster. Godzilla's signature weapon is what? Atomic breath. So what's going on there? What happens in a lot of life is that it's easier to take what already exists and tweak it rather than come up with stuff on your own. The Bible is the most quoted book on the earth, even if people don't realize it. But what Godzilla is Godzilla is very reminiscent of whom? The Leviathan. So get with me. Turn to Genesis 3, but while you're turning there, let me make another point. And I'm just going to make this in passing. When you study Satan in the Scriptures, his form, his appearance changes over time. 2 Corinthians 11 says he hath transformed himself into an angel of light. Satan wasn't created as an angel. He was created as a cherub. If you read the Scriptures, a cherub is not an angel. I know that people have the idea that a cherub is a little baby with wings. That's not what a cherub is in the Bible. It's totally different from that. Satan was created as a cherub, but he's transformed himself into an angel of light. And what happens in the 70th week is Revelation 12, there's war in heaven. Satan and his angels lose, so they're cast down to the earth. And what seems to happen at that point is Satan takes upon the form of a Leviathan. Now, you may not remember this, but we were in Psalm 104. It specifically said that the Leviathan was in the great and wide sea. Specifically used that phrasing in Psalm 104. In the Scriptures, what is the great and wide sea? I'll ask it this way. What is the great and wide sea that is adjacent to the land of Canaan? The Mediterranean. And so what seems to happen is the Leviathan takes up residence in the Mediterranean. Think of it this way. If you're Satan and you got kicked out of heaven and you're cast down to earth, and you know the second coming is about to happen, what would you do? Would you climb the highest mountain and say, "Come get me, I'm ready"? Or would you try to hide in the deepest depth? You'd try to hide in the deepest depth and you'd transform yourself into the most fearsome physical creature you could. That seems to be what he did. I'll just mention this in passing for the sake of time. Do you remember when the Lord encounters Legion in the Gospels? And they say to him, "Art thou come hither to torment us before the time. They ask him a very specific question. They don't say, art thou come hither to torment us? They don't ask him who he is. They know exactly who he is. And they say, art thou come hither to torment us before the time? So do they expect a future time of torment? Clearly. What's happening in those verses is they're right here. The Lord's first coming. They're very fearful that it's something like the second coming. And so what they say to him is, you're early! Right? Art thou come hither to torment us before the time? If you recall, they ask him, cast us not out of the country. Is that because they didn't want to visit a foreign country? Is that because their visas had expired? If he cast them out of the country, where were they going to be cast? Into hell. And what happens is they see, and Scripture specifically says this, they see afar off a herd of swine feeding. Have you ever wondered why a devil would want to be cast into a swine? Like, why would you do such a thing? Well, it's simple. The reason is the swine were afar off. And as soon as they were cast into the swine, what did they do? They ran down into the water. Why'd they do that? You know what's going to happen at the second coming? There's going to be a bunch of devils that conclude the best thing we should do is go hide because the judge is coming back. That's what's going on with all that. Get with me, Acts chapter 20. I have one more point and I'll conclude. I want to deal just for a moment with Genesis 3 and the serpent. People sometimes have the idea that in Genesis 3, Satan showed up and he looked like a snake. You know, in other words, he was 6 feet long. He was as round as a baseball bat or something. And, he showed up as a snake and he said, hi, Eve, and he, told her a bunch of lies. That is not what happened. The serpent is a description, not of his physical appearance, but of his spiritual character. Now, the Leviathan is a description of physical appearance, okay? You're given that extensive description of what it is. But Satan does not show up as a snake and yak at Eve. Look with me at Acts 20, verse 29. The Bible will often use figurative language that describes things according to their spiritual condition, not their physical appearance. So look at Acts 20, verse 29. For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Now is Paul warning them, look, beware of coyotes? Is that what he's saying? He's referring to men entering in, but men whose character, whose spiritual essence is that of wolves. You see the point? That's what's going on in Genesis 3. It's not that Eve was chatting with a snake on the ground. That's not it at all. The serpent is a description of the character of Satan. That's the way to understand that. So I'll close with this thought. The Bible references a bunch of different spiritual creatures. It talks about unicorns, it talks about behemoths, it talks about Leviathan. And the key to all of this is to just take the verses and believe them literally, and the Bible will tell you how to think about what they are. None of them are fake. None of them are fictitious. They're all things that truly existed and that it is good for us to understand. Lord, thank you for